to record now. All right, Joy, did you want to do an introduction or do you want to leave it to us?
I could leave it to you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I am Janette Shaffer. I'm the Assistant State Librarian for Library Advancement, and I have with me Gary. Gary, I'll let you introduce yourself in a second, but I just wanted to also let you know why HR is an interest of mine. I've been a middle manager, proud middle manager for the last probably 25 years, and have dealt with the kind of HR issues that we're going to be talking about on and off for that amount of years. Of course, never in a situation like COVID, so this is new for me as well, but I'll be talking more about the day-to-day practice and dealing with that. And I've been doing that in higher ed mostly and the private sector as well. Gary, how about you?
Thanks, Janette. My name is Gary Deziel. I'm an Extension Assistant Professor at UVM Extension out of ostensibly the St. Albans office, although I haven't been there, of course, since early mid-March. I have been responsible for HR, for the HR of my unit, which was a 180 employee unit, and I've also had as many as 25 direct reports. I hope that has never happened to anybody else on the call. And been, like Janette, a middle manager for quite a number of decades now. I also am certified by the Society for Human Resource Management as a certified human resource professional. So that means I've studied up and taken my exam, and I actually passed. And so, but like Janette says, there's a lot here that may be familiar to you, like ADA, American with Disabilities Act, or other things. But the COVID-19 certainly has added quite a number of new twists. So hand it back to Janette.
Thanks, Gary. So let us move to, so what really brought the need for this webinar to our attention was the fact that we're seeing, obviously we're responding very quickly, and we need to respond very quickly to COVID-19 and what that means for HR and ADA as part of that. And what came to our attention was that we needed to remind folks over and over again that there are some basic operational things that everybody should be doing as a manager of people and running an organization, and also dealing with their bosses, in your cases, most likely the board. So as middle managers, you always have a boss, the board, and you most likely have people that you're managing as well, and that's probably why you're here. So regardless of what the situation is right now with COVID, there's certain things that everybody should always be doing regardless when managing personnel. You should always be putting job descriptions in place. You should always be doing annual evaluations, and also in between annual evaluations have periodic formal check-ins on goals and on any performance issues, because what you don't want to happen is that you sit down for the annual evaluation and everything's been fine for an entire year, and in your evaluation all of a sudden you're surprising your person with performance issues that have been bothering you for the whole year. So those folks should really never be surprised at what is in that annual evaluation. They should see it coming because you will have had regular check-ins with them. Always communicate in a timely and consistent way, up and down and sideways. So to your colleagues, if you have peers that are at your level, so co-directors, for instance, and then also be transparent to both your board and to your staff, while still really retaining privacy. If there's privacy issues, you obviously aren't quite as transparent, but you should really let your staff know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Always come from a place of empathy and respect. It will serve you well in the long run when you're operating on that place. Now, we very much work in a handshake environment in Vermont. You know, everybody knows everybody. One of your staff people is likely to be the cousin of your spouse, or, you know, and it gets a little touchy because we know people and we're part of their community and they're part of our community, or we're even related to them. It is really good to handle things very formally. So be consistent with everybody so that you can never be accused of favoritism or dealing with one person in a different way than the other. So it's good to do all of these things that are listed on this PowerPoint all the time and do them the same for everybody. So it's really important to be doing that, especially to also cut down on some of the awkwardness. It's incredibly awkward to deal with performance evaluations if there are performance issues, if this is a person that you know privately as well, or if you have a personal connection to them. But if you do this across the board and you tell everybody you're doing this across the board the same way, then it becomes less awkward. It's still awkward, there's no doubt, anytime you sit down about a performance issue. Also know when to ask for help, and ask for help as soon as you have sort of even a pink flag go up. Ask the people that are there for you. So be it us, be it your trustees, they're there to help you also manage your library. If you're a municipality, ask the folks at VLCT, or look at some of their resources. They have really great resources available to you. And also don't be shy to ask an attorney. Now, we know that this is a resource-intensive thing, having an attorney and asking an attorney for help for both the business of your library, but you may also need privately an attorney for any labor-related issues. So I would rather ask before things kind of spin out of control than not ask and ask for help later. Now, I talked a little bit about being really formal in your day-to-day practice and documenting and writing things down in your communications. This is particularly important if you're trying to roll out new ideas for new programming, new operational processes and things like that, or when you're moving to non-standard practice, which has kind of been the case with COVID. We're always really doing non-standard practice as we're making it up as we go, basically. Really always put that in writing. It is so important to let everybody know in a formal proposal what it is you intend to do. And when you're writing formal proposals, always anticipate the pros and cons, the questions that your board might ask, any sort of concerns that they have. Try to pre-anticipate those and really delineate those in your formal proposal. So basically you're going to write, you know, what is your proposal? Why are you doing it? What are the goals you're trying to achieve? And then what do you anticipate are the pros and the cons of that? What are the costs of this proposal? And again, it's anytime you want to deviate from standard practice, or if you want to implement a new idea. Come ready to negotiate and to hear concerns and to work with those concerns. Anytime you're making a proposal, it's a give and take, and you might learn something. And most people appreciate the courage that you're putting into an ask, even if it might seem outlandish at first. But as long as you're writing down and you're really demonstrating that you're doing this very purposefully and you've thought it through really well. Now, proposals, like I said, can be anything from new ideas to non-standard practice, but you may also have to at some point propose needing an accommodation for a COVID-related ADA issue. So those are all things that you should put in writing, and you should come ready to negotiate and kind of engage in this back and forth with your folks. You should also have the courage to ask your staff for input on your proposal. They might have some ideas that you hadn't thought of. So it's a really nice way to do new things and to demonstrate that you've thought it through. So that is my introduction. So, you know, even if it's non-standard practice right now, do the standard things all the time that you would normally do. And I'm going to hand it off to Gary, who can now talk about the COVID-related things.
Okay, thank you, Janette. And I think I can forward this on my screen, so we'll see if that works.
Yeah, and I just did this one for you, so you're set.
Okay, thank you very much. As I put these slides together, I really put them together, not really, I was thinking of course, of a library director, but I was also thinking of a chair of a trustees board, or as an employee who reports to a director, who reports to a chair. So I'm trying to cover a lot of different bases here. So to give you a kind of like this wide taste of the laws and some of the questions and answers that might exist out there. This is a very complicated matter. HR is always very complicated because there's federal laws, there's state laws, there's all sorts of things coming together. And I will be giving the next 10 or so slides, but Janette will be popping in, I hope, when she feels it appropriate to add and to clarify things or something that I missed that she'd like to say. So thank you, Janette, in advance. First, Vermont is an at-will state. You've probably heard that before. At-will simply means, and nearly all the states in the United States are at-will. I think there's one or two that aren't. At-will means that an employer can let go, terminate at will whenever they would like to, with or without cause. So that's kind of like a basic rule of employment in Vermont. That said, going back to what Janette said, if you're a part of a municipality, you've got different rights because there's personnel procedures have been developed over time. If you're a part of a collective bargaining union, a union, that's very specific in your rights. So there's a lot of things to consider, but essentially Vermont is an at-will state. A couple other things I wanted to talk about was I just want to underline consistency. Treat all employees the same. That'll really make your life so much better. Medical records are strictly private. They should be kept separate from personnel records because personnel records really should only be viewed by those with a need to know, and medical records are actually even more restrictive. And then don't make assumptions. That is, when you're thinking about like COVID-19, you're thinking about, oh, this person is over a certain age and maybe they have, that they have this, something that perhaps would give them higher risk under COVID-19, or that they have, a disability under ADA, but you cannot make assumptions. You cannot make an assumption saying to yourself as a supervisor that, oh, this person doesn't want to come in because they're at risk. You can't make those kind of assumptions. You have to treat all employees equally. If you do engage in an assessment process, say there is an issue about coming back to work, it's an interactive process. So this again goes back to one of Janette's comments is communication. So communication is key. I'm just underlining that again, communication. And then documentation. Documentation, of course, is a mantra in the HR world because any decision you make, document it, and you need to document why you made the decision. And if any of you have been unfortunately through a termination process or a personnel corrective kind of process, having true records about annual reports, formal quarterly meetings, documenting situations is always best practice. And it did work when I hit the slide. Janette, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to chime in really quickly. For those of you who have asked us questions, who submitted questions ahead of time, I just want to mention that we will roll the answers into what Gary's talking about. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Janette. And I do have them in front of me. So if Janette, you keep an eagle eye on that and see if I can get to them. Some human resource laws and regulations that may affect reopening and how you're doing business. Age Discrimination Employment Act, which prohibits discrimination for those 40 and older. I've always been surprised at that number. To me, 40 sounds pretty young. That's me on my daily commute, if you see the picture. VOSHA and OSHA, that is a law that you've heard of, OSHA reviews and we're going to call OSHA. Well, basically what it means is that workers have a right to safe working conditions. So that's a protection for you, and that's a protection for your employees. And when you connect it with COVID-19, that connects with the Agency of Commerce and Community Development here in Vermont, their recommendations on reopening, about the social distancing, about physical partitions, that sort of thing. I just lost my presentation, but
Gary, I'll reload it. Hang on a second.
Okay, but that was pretty much it with that slide. It's just VOSHA comes into play, Age Discrimination and Employment Act comes into play, and then let me see if I can forward it. It's back here.
Actually, Gary, will you take over presenting, because then we'll actually see you move your slides.
Okay,
So
I'm gonna do it.
Okay, there you go.
There, okay.
You're all set.
So you should see a slide that says families first. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So here's a big law that's come into effect. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act requires certain, and I put it in red, employers to provide their employees with paid sick leave. If you're larger than 500 employees, this act doesn't apply to you. And if you're smaller than 50 employees, then you can get out of it. It's an exemption, a small business exemption. But essentially, all employees have a right to paid sick leave, 2 weeks of paid sick leave if you get COVID-19, or if a family member gets COVID-19, or you've got childcare issues, things like that. You get 2 weeks paid at 66.6%, or 2/3 pay for 2 weeks. And then you also, every employee is covered by the FMLA, Federal Medical Leave Act, which gives you 12 weeks in a 12-month period of medical leave without the fear of losing your job. And this expands it to an additional 10 more weeks onto the program. And it's through, as you can see, December 31st. Now, municipal public employees are a little bit different than nonprofit corporations. So I know in Vermont, about 60% of the public libraries are municipal, and about 35% are incorporated. So they are different. And a nonprofit corporation is considered, it's a small business. Municipal, of course, you're connected right at the hip to your town. So it differs. I'm not going to talk very much about this law at all, because there's a reference slide for the presentation too. But I did want to mention that this is important for employees to have this, backdrop of support. Now, again, there are a lot of small rural libraries in Vermont, and so you may not even have sick leave. So if there's questions about that, we can get back to it. But I think I have a slide or two talking about sick leave, or a point at least. Let's see if I can. There we go. So this is a big one, Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. It celebrates its 30th birthday on Saturday, July 16th. And it includes the requirement for a reasonable accommodation and non-discrimination based on disability. And there's also rules in the law about what an employer may ask for instance, medical examinations and inquiries to the primary care provider. So this ADA is something that probably most people would be thinking about when they're thinking about returning to work, and the things around that might require an accommodation. Now, remember, you always go back to the Agency Commerce and Community Development, the ACCD guidelines on how we're reopening work. And of course, Vermont Library also has these great recommendations on opening libraries, you know, curbside, what comes first, all the considerations. So you think about those things first. But the ADA, when we talk about a reasonable accommodation, that's a change in the work environment that allows the individual with a disability to have an equal opportunity to provide the job's essential functions. So going back to Janette's, one of her first, I think it was her first slide, job descriptions. So job descriptions are really important, what employees do. Now, an accommodation, if it poses an undue hardship, or that is the employer has a very difficult time to do it, or maybe it's so cost prohibitive, the employer can't do it, they do not have to provide the accommodation. However, they still must consider other ways to provide the accommodation. And in the slide, I noticed I put in big letters, negotiation. And this goes back to Janette's comment about communication and how, and my bullet about an interactive process. So if you have a concern or an employee has a concern, it's really about communication, understanding the law, you know, to your best of ability. Bring in those experts when you need second and third opinions, but it's really about a negotiation. Last week, my boss emailed me because we are doing the same as libraries are. We're doing a reopening plan. And it was a very simple question. He asked me, where would you like to work from? Home or at the office? And I responded, at the office, because the ACCD, of course, one of their first things they say is work remotely if you can. And I am very fortunate in that I can. But that's part of the communication process, is him understanding what my job was, and me communicating and him asking, opening up the dialogue, and talking about that.
Gary, if I might chime in again.
Yes.
So I've mentioned this before in my introduction. You may never have thought that you will need to ask for an accommodation, for an ADA accommodation, and I urge you to rethink that point of view if you do have a COVID-related health situation that might require you to ask for an accommodation. So just kind of take a step back from the idea that you don't have a disability that needs to be accommodated. COVID-19 has changed that, and you should consider this as a right that you have at your disposal. And you might also consider it for your staff if they have COVID-related issues. Again, you can't directly ask about it, but just be aware that COVID has changed a lot of things that might make you be able to ask for an accommodation. Don't be shy is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and thank you, Janette. CDC has put together a list of comorbidities, they call them, or factors, health factors that you may have that increase risk of a higher impact of COVID-19. And Janette is entirely right. You know, those things affect, like the ability or the need for an accommodation. We can't ask for medical examinations or inquiries unless they're very job related. That is consistent with our business's necessity. So, and that has to be really documented very well. If there's a reasonable belief that an employee's ability to perform the job function will be impaired by a medical condition, or if the employee will pose a direct threat due to a medical condition, we can ask for medical medical guidance. So again, this is, I work for a large organization, which is very different than a small organization. And I actually moved to Vermont from working with a two-person organization. There was my boss, and there was me, who said, when he said jump, I said how high. It's a small. So I've worked in small organizations. In UVM, we actually do ask for medical related information, but supervisors don't actually see that because it goes direct to HR, and HR makes a determination and says, okay, you have to do an accommodation. In this case, you're just going to have to use your best judgment and all the time protect that employee's right to privacy or your right to privacy. So if you're on the call because you have a concern about yourself personally, know that you have these very, very stringent protections on your medical privacy and your personnel privacy as well. Moving on a little bit, I have a handful of slides that talk about some of the questions that sometimes are being more commonly asked, and what you could do, or some of the guidance. And this is based on a webinar I recently attended from the chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, who runs ADA essentially, and runs some of the other businesses, the compliance part of it. So, I mean, can we make assumptions about older workers or workers with disabilities, exclusionary actions, for instance, like saying, oh, that employee is 66 years old. They will want not to come in, so I have to think about that. No, you have to treat every employee the same. So you just cannot make assumptions. The really, really fast way to get into trouble is to treat employees differently between one employer and another. Second bullet there is about age, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. You actually don't have to accommodate for age. There is no accommodation required. However, it is not illegal to treat or favor an older worker over a younger worker. That is, if you're thinking about, okay, remote work, or we need somebody physically in the library, but there's this person that they've indicated to us some things, as a supervisor. We can favor the older worker and assign that older worker remote work to protect that older worker over a younger worker. And younger, remember, is about 40, is 40, actually less than 40 years old. Janette, do you have any comments about these first couple?
No, I don't. I just, as I'm hearing you talk about these things, everybody, if you can just be aware that obviously we're touching on some of the high points and the general ideas about this. There's a lot to digest and a lot to think about. So again, don't hesitate to ask if you have a situation that takes a little bit, that needs a deeper dive. It gets a little overwhelming. There's a lot of stuff here. So just know that.
Yeah, there is, and there will be some time here to ask questions in the chat, and that I hope that is useful to you if someone has a specific question. Antibody testing, it's an evolving area. Employer cannot require this test at this time. That's the current recommendation. Okay, here's another one that this is probably, like on the webinar I was at, it was just like the chair of the EEOC said, this is like the big question, is you're living with someone at high risk. What can ADA do for you? And it doesn't require the employer to accommodate for the employee. Now, to be clear, going back to Janette's empathy and management of this whole situation is that I believe strongly, but that the employer can offer flexibility with consistency. So we're in this situation where you almost have to take it by a case basis, communicate really well. The person in the decision-making place has it really tough right now because they have to use their judgment. They have to understand the laws a little bit. But right now, say you're living with, your older parent, and you going to work and coming back home puts them at risk. And UVM, a large company, has said that just fill out a form. This is for faculty coming back to teaching. They said, like, even if it is related to somebody you live with, put it down on a piece of paper. It goes to also the ADA compliance person. But it sounds like UVM is saying, like, if you're in that situation, we're not going to make you be in person. So, boy, I mean, it goes from employer to employer, but by the law, ADA doesn't protect employees with people at home who are at greater risk. Poor performance. This is an interesting thing. I've read some statistics about increased productivity. I've read statistics about decreased productivity. The employer can do as they feel appropriate. Now, again, you have to take it within the context of your municipality, if you're a municipal library, or if you're a not-for-profit corporation, you're kind of on your own. So the employer doesn't have to continue the way things have been going, especially as the governor and the executive orders start diminishing about stay at home and as we open up and follow the directions of and guidance of CDC and the governments. So, if you're really having a hard time with an employee, the best, most appropriate thing would perhaps reconnect with that employee in a physical way, that they would have to really come back to the library to work. And they really don't have a choice. An employee doesn't have a choice, except if the telework is ADA related. And we're going to get to fear in a little bit, but if the request to continue working from afar is related to an ADA request, then you really have to understand review what they're thinking about, understand what the accommodation might be, review alternatives, and then make a decision one way or another. But this is a tricky thing. Poor performance is a tricky thing, even when you see the person day to day, and this makes it more difficult. But the employer has no obligation to keep that employee employed based on to continuation of telework. If you want to reopen your library, if you're going from curbside to window service to a kind of a managed path through stacks, you're going to need employees in the office. I mean, in the library. Pregnancy must be treated the same as any other employee in their ability or inability. That is, if the woman who has a pregnancy is ordered by their doctor to reduce something, or then they have to be treated equally. But pregnancy, based on their ability, treat as all other employees. COVID-19 tracing, the employer can do that. But also consider your need to know, because if you start going down some medical paths, these are medical files, and they are private and should be separate from personnel files. And I was just reading this morning, and this is in the ACCD guidance. There's a template for for opening up, and talks about what you need to do as an employer, temperature, all these things you need to check and check off, have a safety officer, that sort of thing. And at the end it says if you start keeping medical records, it says in black and white, keep these 30 years after the employee departs. That's what it says. And so so that's a long time. Pre-existing conditions. Can you ask? You can ask. For instance, companies are putting together surveys, and it's saying on the survey, do you have a pre-existing condition? They don't want to know what, and they're not asking any specific questions. So they're consistent with every employee. Every employee gets the same questionnaire. But if the employee checks yes, then it goes to a higher level, and then it kicks in about a medical, an officer, HR person, or supervisor contacting that employee. So the key here is you cannot ask specifics, and I think Janette referred to that. This is an odd part, of managing humans in our businesses and in our libraries today, is that there's things that common sense, you would think, yeah, this is just a discussion, but actually this is privacy. This is about law, and you cannot ask about pre-existing conditions unless you ask all your employees, and it's a very non-specific way. And once you learn something, then it kicks into the process about interactive process, talking about accommodations that might be necessary. Here's a question about after vacation quarantine, and someone, I think this is one of the ones that was asked, is that, okay, have an employee who's they're going on vacation. Can I tell them that they can't go to Cleveland, Ohio, to see the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because they are a red county on the ACCD map, and they've got 800 cases per million people right now. You, as a supervisor, you have the right and authority to decline vacation. So it starts there. I mean, you have to look at the whole picture. You can't tell somebody where they can vacation or not vacation, but if it impacts your business, if they are going to someplace where upon return they have to quarantine, then you have to think about how that affects your business. So, okay, they have to come back 7 days after their vacation. They have to quarantine and then get a test. So you have to think about, how's that affect library work? What can I do? Do I have hourly employees in in my community that I hire on an occasional basis that I can bring in? So, and if there's no vacation time, of course, they would have to go out if you can't find work for them. If telework is not feasible, then it would be leave without pay. Fear is another one that I've heard a lot about, that people are very anxious to return to work, and that's just normal. My wife she's worked from home a couple days, but she works at the University of Vermont Medical Center, and have had employees with a lot of anxiety, and everybody has this kind of anxiety about what's going on. Of course, right now, going to the hospital is probably the safest place you can be, not the grocery store, for instance. But if it's fear, there's generalized fear and there's specific fear. If it's a generalized fear about, I'm just afraid to go back to work, then the supervisor has a responsibility to explain what's being done, what's going on. And, our public library staff are small enough too, so that you're probably already doing this. Everyone knows that, okay, we're doing curbside Tuesday and Saturday, and, working up to window service, and maybe opening stacks, we'll see what happens. But if it could be, so you're meeting VOSHA requirements, right? You're making sure that the environment is safe. social distancing, plexiglass maybe between the window service and the outside, that sort of masks, all those things. But if it's a specific fear, that is, if it's an actual fear that triggers right into to an anxiety that is medically, is a mental illness, then that is ADA protected. So we'd go through the same process, that interactive process, about what can we do to accommodate this employee, and what can we do? So it's just communication and interactive process. We cannot, well, as of last Friday morning, the CDC was saying that we cannot do mandatory COVID-19 testing for our employees. But now there are 5 scenarios which they just published Friday afternoon. I didn't memorize them, but I don't think it really relates here in the library situation. But I'd have to review that more if there's further questions about that. This is just a bit of a wrap up. This is, of course, the place to go is COVID-19 Recovery Resource Center, Agency of Commerce and Community Development. They have guidance, specific guidance on municipalities, as well as museums, which are tied up with the arts and creative works. There's different subsections, and I know that you know about it because it talks about how many people you can have in your facility based on square footage and that sort of thing, and the phased restart work safe guidance. But I didn't have much more to add. This is a really toothy kind of topic because there's so much to it. There's Vermont laws, there's federal laws, there's different organizations that watchdog different things, Department of Labor and VOSHA, EEOC and ADA compliance. If you're a municipality, it's going to be different than if you're a not-for-profit corporation. If you're a unionized employee, it's much different than if you are non-unionized. If you work for an incorporated library, it's going to be different than working for a municipality. There's all sorts of layers there. So I think the best we could do is, Janette, if you didn't have any questions, I have a reference slide that I think that we'll be sending to you. Everything from question and answers on EEOC to Families First. As Janette said earlier, try to get information for yourself. And here are some pretty easy FAQ kind of places that should be helpful. And then I just wanted to say, before we went to questions and answers, or at least questions, thank you. And there is an evaluation that we'd love you to take today, because my bosses love to see that I'm doing things that help people. So,
and indeed you are, Gary. This is really helpful to hear the expert view on this. And the rules are the rules, but they're never as black and white when we're dealing with human beings as well. There's always that human aspect that is so important. So please go ahead and post your questions into the chat if you can. We had one question that came in to us that was about sort of preserving people's privacy. So either a colleague of a person who has to be out for health reasons, or even a patron comes in and asks where's Joe and where's he been? How come he's not coming to work? You really need to protect that person's privacy, and you can be very sort of broad and say, well, Joe has to not be in the physical library for now. And I can't tell you more. So just be really broad about that as well. So that was one of the questions we had. I think we responded to the other question about, what was it? Hang on a second, let me just look. Out-of-state travel.
Out-of-state travel, right?
Yeah, that was the one. So again, you can't, it's none of your business really where a person goes, but what you should do is ask very broadly, are you going to a place that will require you to quarantine when you come back? So that's a pretty important question before you approve any leave, and then make sure that folks are aware of the consequences of that. And for those of you who are on the phone, you can unmute yourself and ask your question if you'd like. We can do voice questions as well. And even if you're not on the phone, if you're just in the chat, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions as well. And Laura and Joy, from a consultant's perspective, if you have anything to add, that would be helpful as well. And we had a question here. When staff quarantine, when they come back from vacation out of state, they need to use their own time for this, correct? Yes and no. So the human aspect of this says, well, if you can provide them with enough work that they could spend their quarantine teleworking, you could probably work something out for them. However, if their work really requires them to be on site, then yes, they have to use their own time if they have it. And if they don't have it, then that would be unpaid. Does that answer your question, Nancy? Okay, thanks. What about a staff member who has family visit from a state that requires quarantine? Oh boy, Lucinda. Gary, I'm gonna pass that on to you.
Well, the staff member is in the shed right out back, so it should be. Right. Oh man, I was just reading something about that this morning about travel. But when it comes down to business and not-for-profit incorporated or municipal libraries, it's really, when you're coming into an employment situation, it's really about you. What is the answer to that one?
Go ahead.
The ACCD is saying, like, if you're from one of these counties above 400 per million, don't come, please. Or if you come, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks, or the 1 week in the test. What were you going to say, Janette?
Well, quarantining means you are to quarantine yourself from the folks around you that would be affected, including the people. Having people quarantine at your house in your own personal space kind of defeats quarantine. Now, we all know that this happens, and we have people come in and they're careful. It really comes down to, it's, as employers, we have to also rely to a certain extent that you will do the responsible thing, because I can't ask who you have staying with you, just like I can't ask whether you have somebody who is in a risk category living with you. That's not my right to know or my responsibility to give space to as well. So there's a certain level of responsibility you have to take for your own environment as an employee, as it is my responsibility as an employer to also protect you from the elements to the extent possible on my end. So it's very nuanced, as are all things HR, really. But again, you really, from a personal perspective, you really shouldn't have somebody quarantining in your space, because it defeats quarantine. It puts you in the position of having to quarantine yourself.
Right. That's a wonderful answer. And as an employer, that's not something you can ask, really. You ask the employee, or the employee has to self-certify. Yeah, I got no cough. I can smell things just as well as yesterday. Got no fever. All those things. It doesn't say, has your buddy come up from New Haven, Connecticut in the last 14 weeks? That's not a checkbox. So you have to rely on your employee to protect the environment, or yourself. So the ethical thing to do is really say, guy, you really can't come up until you're on that list, no matter what you know about the person. because you're putting everybody at risk. If somebody comes up, you really ethically need to quarantine with them, like Janette said. It's just because you're functionally, you just moved yourself from Ohio or from Alabama into your house.
Right. Other questions? We did have a non-COVID related question about criminal background checks that we might be able to address while other questions might be coming in.
Right.
Do you want me to pull that up, or do you have it
I've
memorized,
got
Gary?
it right in front of me. You know,
Okay,
can
great.
or should a library run a criminal background and sex offender checks on all library volunteers and staff? So that's something that your library can do. The UVM extension, we run a background check, a criminal background check on, and a sex offender check on all volunteers who work for 4-H, for instance, volunteers for 4-H, and volunteers are huge in 4-H, and it's a youth program. And also any employee who does work with youth in UVM extension goes through special training as well. So yes, the library can do that. If you are a municipal library, I would check with your town administrator, see about VLCT, what their guidance is. But this is something you definitely can do, and you work with children all the time. And in our library, for instance, we don't have enough staff to have more than one person there at a time. So it's a good practice. Unfortunately, it costs money, so that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, it costs money and it expires after a while as well.
Right.
Okay, so can you talk a little bit about how telework situations affect workman's comp expectations?
Wow.
Amy, is that if somebody gets injured at their home while they're teleworking? So if I fell out of my chair right now and hit my head, is that what you're asking? Yes, injury while working virtually. Oh, that's a good one.
That's a good one. I don't think that workman's comp extends to a short-term home office unless it was very specific related to equipment that this is just based on experience. This is I think we'll have to research this, but if the equipment was provided by the employer, then it would. But like UVM is very clear to me. They don't provide internet. They don't pay me for anything. There's no indirect cost they're going to reimburse me about. If I tripped up my stairs so I wouldn't hurt myself as badly, I'll just put a Band-Aid on. I mean, if I hurt myself, I think that's on me. But this would be a good test case. We'll have to research that one. Whoa.
Yeah, let's research that one. And then we had another question that had come in, not through the form, but on email about the Families First Response Act. Did we cover that one adequately?
Let's see. It was about right for library staff with sick leave benefits and for those who are without any paid time off, even in the same institution. How does Families First Coronavirus Act work? So we know basically how it works. It gives you 2 weeks of paid or partially paid, depending on the situation, plus 10 weeks more of FMLA leave. But then the question goes on, when do you invoke the act? It's invoked by an actual COVID-19. Somebody has to have COVID-19. Either the employee, and then there's the 2 weeks paid leave time, or a member of the family. Then there's the 2 weeks at 66.6% paid leave time. And if it's an extended period, you get 10 more weeks of Family Medical Leave Act. Now, no one has to pay you during that period. That just protects you from losing your job. So FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, really protects you from losing your job. And if you're lucky enough, you have enough vacation and sick leave or combined time off to cover that. Let's see. Say the sick leave must be used by the end of the year. The deadline for this is December 31st. So it works together with that sick leave in that particular library. And if you have to quarantine or longer and are out of sick leave, how's this new act relate to you? Again, if you're below 50 employees, your library can actually get a small business exemption and the way you get a small business exemption is that this is going to bankrupt us if we have to pay for this. But also, I think it's a time that a lot of companies are considering more humane sick leave and personnel policies too. Is that like, okay, if you get COVID-19 and your employee, if you're under 500 employees and you do not take the small business exemption, you have to pay 100% of 2 weeks leave. Whether you have a paid sick leave policy or not, but after that time, then you're free. Janette, did you or Laura, Joy, add anything to that?
Not to that specifically. FMLA is something that you should kind of know about because it's important in non-COVID times as well. Very important right for employees as well, and you as well as an employee. Amy had a question about more broadly, do you recommend telework guidelines and limits? I recommend, and I think Gary, you and I talked about this, telework is a privilege that you are able to extend when you're able to extend it. You can make the rules for teleworking as a supervisor. You can work with your employee on work hours. You can make work schedules. You're also able to do what we call a desk audit in HR. So you can check in with them and see if they've completed their tasks. So the only thing we recommend, and we always come back to this, is be consistent with everybody. If you are making rules and guidelines for telework for one person, you need to do it for everybody else, just so that if somebody comes back and accuses you of not playing fairly, you can document it. But again, telework is a bonus, it's a perk. That you really have control over. And if it doesn't work out because somebody isn't performing well, you can always rescind it. And I don't know if Gary, you have anything to add, and we're also at a minute right now.
Yes, right. The only thing I add, Janette, is that you can favor an older worker over a young worker legally. And if it's ADA, you got a whole different kettle of fish. If it's just telework for an employee, then it's exactly as you said. There was a question from Amy before we run out of time. What is the library obligated to provide FMLA to the rest of the staff? Employees have FMLA, whether they think they have it. It's a federal mandate. So everyone has FMLA. And in Vermont, I think there's also Vermont. There's also something in addition, actually.
Yes, there is. Yep.
Yes, right. So every employee has it. This doesn't mean you'll get paid or you'll receive benefits. It just means that you will be protected from your losing your job. But after that 12 weeks is up, the employer can say, I can't do that. I need an employee, so they can hire again.
Yeah. So we're at time. Thank you so much for coming, and keep the questions coming. We will probably offer a few more of these HR things, right, Gary? Because there's so much to talk about. Okay, yes. Obviously, since we're at time, please fill out the form and be in touch and stay cool. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Janette.